Okay, in part one, we discussed the fact that a juvenile is a youth who is at or below the upper age of original jurisdiction in their residential state or their resident state, wherever it is that they live. And when we look at these juveniles, there are two different types of justice that are suggested or intended by punishment, if you will. So when we look at these, okay, we're going to start this second part of our Chapter 1 discussion by talking about in part one of our juvenile justice system discussion, we talked about the fact that a juvenile is a youth who is at or above the upper age of original jurisdiction in their resident state. And the thing you need to understand going into this is that the juvenile system is kind of a one-pot approach, and that can potentially be a disservice to some of the youths involved because it handles multiple groups of children, including those who are abused and neglected, the ones who have committed a status crime or a status offense, shall we say, as well as the ones who are delinquents. These all go into the same juvenile system. So, and we also find that there's two different kinds of justice that we see in this system. And the first one is what they call retribution justice. And I actually am going to read this definition so that I get it correctly. Retributive justice seeks revenge or recompense for unlawful behavior and harkens back to the ancient concept of an eye for an eye. The other kind of justice that we see is restorative justice, and that's what we would hope to see for most of our first-time juvenile offenders, for sure. And that's the kind of justice that focuses on repairing the harm done to victims and to the community and stresses that offenders must contribute to the repair. So hopefully that would make it more of a learning type experience rather than an eye for an eye kind of situation. The terminology of the juvenile system underscores its emphasis on protecting youth from the harmful labels and the stigmatizing effects of being considered a criminal or an offender. And we see that because youth or children are not arrested, they're taken into custody. And if the allegations against the youth are true, then the youth is a delinquent rather than a criminal. And when we have a youth who is taken into custody, they are sentenced to custodial care upon release, and we call that aftercare instead of parole. So there's some of the things are similar, but we give it a different name in the hope that the long-term effect will be different. So when we talk about the juvenile justice system, I think it's important that we take a look at the structure and the organization of the juvenile system. Law enforcement is typically the gatekeeper to the system, even though juveniles can enter that system by other routes. Within the law enforcement component, juveniles are assigned to a separate division or may be handled by all officers. And that depends a lot on the size of the city, community, wherever it is that they are. A small town or a rural area is less likely to have a set of officers that their only job is to work with juveniles. Instead, I actually worked with juvenile services as a contract worker several years ago, and I'm sure that some of this has changed since the last time I worked with them was probably before 2006, maybe even earlier than that. But in the late 1990s, here in McCurtain County, which is where I worked with them, and that's a county in Oklahoma, when a juvenile was taken into custody, if they had to stay, particularly if it was evening or night, or if they were having a problem finding a judge to hear the case and decide what to do with them, many times they would be brought into the adult facility, whether that was the sheriff's department or the police station. When they were brought in there, that's when they would call me. And basically my job was very much a glorified babysitter. The only difference is that sometimes, depending on the severity of the offense, my child or youth might be in leg irons or might be in handcuffs. And sometimes they were just put in a room free to move about that room, but not free to leave that room. And so my job was to sit there with them throughout the night or until they were able to either release them to the care of a parent or release them to the court system in some way. And the purpose of that was to ensure that while they were in a police station or they were in a jail, that they did not come into contact with the adult offenders who might be much more hardened and who could possibly do harm to them. So it was more of a protection for them even though they were in custody. The other thing that I did for juvenile services was that when they were released back into that custodial care or aftercare, they were often released on a dependency that they would be at home and under custodial care unless they were in school. And they called that in-home detention. And children who were placed on in-home detention required that someone check on them each day, and sometimes even very late into the night, and ensure that they were in fact where they were supposed to be. And so they hired contract workers to come in, and what we would do is we called their school each day if they were supposed to be in school. We called their home when they were supposed to be at home, or we visited their home. And we did that very much on a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing. Most of us really had a schedule that we followed, but we tried to make that schedule erratic enough that they couldn't depend on us showing up at a certain time. For instance, with one person that I supervised, we knew that they would go into their bedroom until after their parents went to sleep, and then about 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night they would slip out their window and they would leave. And so for their particular detention, now this was not the norm. Normally you would go during the day or late in the evening, but not normally after 10 or 11 o'clock at night. But for this particular offender, it was considered perfectly acceptable for me to show up midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, knocking on their door to ensure that the child was in fact where he was supposed to be. So that's some of the kind of ways that they might come into the system and also leave the system. There are centralized states that are characterized by a state executive agency that have across the state board control of services. And then there's the decentralized states that are characterized by local authorities having control and running the detention centers, and they also share some of the responsibility for the aftercare services with the state agencies. And then there are those combination states, and of course that's just like the name implies. They tend to have a mix of state-controlled and locally operated delinquency services. And in some instances, the state divides the responsibility for the services between the executive and the judicial branch. So there's a lot of different ways that these are set up. And while schools and child protective services and an abundance of treatment and counseling services are also a part of that functioning and success of the juvenile systems, the police and courts and corrections are the three components that comprise that formal juvenile justice system. And each of these components acts independently, but also interdependently as the total system functions together. So states do tend to vary in a lot of the ways that they handle juvenile things. They vary in the age. We've already talked a little bit about that. In many states, older juveniles can be transferred into the adult system. And sometimes, of course, that depends on the severity of the crime and if we're looking at a status offense or a delinquency. What happens in one component, though, does directly depend and affect the other two components. So when one component attempts to change its policies or procedures with regard to the way they process a juvenile, then the change places a workload pressure on the other two components as well. And let's talk just briefly about that juvenile justice process. Actually, we're going to do that in a part 3. So it's a very important part, so I will see you back for part 3.